I'm Kent Myers.
I'm Mick Cornett, and it's time for the verdict.
As a part of its traditional and continuing commitment to public and community service, Crowe and Dunleavy Law Firm presents The Verdict, an objective discussion of contemporary legal issues hosted by Kent Myers. And also brought to you by a friend of Oklahoma Lawyers for Children and Delta Dental Plan of Oklahoma. And welcome to The Verdict. I'm Mick Cornett, and if you are a regular viewer, you know my co-host is one of Oklahoma's top legal experts, Kent Myers. And today, Kent, we will tackle the First Amendment.
Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, the First Amendment in part, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, and as a matter of fact, for two shows. We are going to be discussing a right that is vigorously defended by the press and others as being very important, and quite frankly is pretty constantly in the news nowadays itself because of things that are going on. Today we've got not just two experts on the First Amendment. We actually have three because I'm sitting next to one. I'd like to tell you that Mick is a journalism graduate, teaches journalism at the University of Oklahoma, but is still our co-host and not one of our guests today, but will probably be taking part in the discussion with the role of an expert. I think for our viewers, one thing we're going to try to come to some conclusions about at the end of the show, or at least we hope you will come to some conclusions about, is do we have too much freedom of speech? Do we have too little freedom of speech? And does the right to it change depending upon the circumstances and what's going on in the country at the time?
There is always a battle between freedom of speech. There is always going to be this branch of journalism that wants more, and where do we draw the line? And I don't think that's going to disappear. I think the discussion today is where should we draw the line today in 2001?
Yes, I think it will, and we oftentimes say that the discussion on this show is lively. I think I can promise our viewers today the discussion will be lively.
Freedom of speech. How can something so basic be so complicated? Should be a lively show. You're watching The Verdict with Mick Cornett and Kent Myers. We'll be right back.
The Journal-Record is pleased to be a sponsor of The Verdict. The Journal-Record, since 1903, the best source of Oklahoma business news and legal information.
I enrich our cultural landscape.
I help define our quality of life.
I am one of 4,000 artists in central Oklahoma who receive
support from Allied Arts, this community's united arts organization.
I am an allied artist.
In Oklahoma, there are more than 1,600 children waiting to be adopted. They're of all ages, and for many, home has been a source of pain and conflict. They've dreamed of finding a better life and a loving family. Consider adoption. For more information, call 1-877-OK-SWIFT or visit the website www.okdhs.org. Adopt. It may be the toughest job you'll ever love.
And Blankenship has stopped at the line of scrimmage. No gain on the play. Leaving it 4th and 7 on the Tiger 46-yard line. 38 seconds on the clock. The Tigers have no choice but to go for it. Wiggins had to do the kicking. Here's the snap. And the kick is away.
All children deserve a life of hope and love, but sometimes they experience a life of pain, neglect, and abuse.
When that happens, each child deserves all of the quality assistance and representation that can be offered in our legal system. Oklahoma Lawyers for Children has over 350 of the best attorneys and volunteers in Oklahoma County who donate their time and services to represent children. For more information, call 405-23-CHILD.
Oklahoma Lawyers for Children, helping to bring hope and love back to the lives of abused children.
And welcome back to The Verdict. Mick Cornett with Kent Myers, who's going to introduce our guests.
Today we have two guests, both know a lot about the subject that we're going to be talking about. On my right is Ben Blackstock. Ben is a native Oklahoman. For 44 years, Ben was Executive Vice President of the Oklahoma Press Association. He's a University of Oklahoma graduate in journalism, a World War II vet, and a fierce defender of freedom of the press and the openness of records and information. Ben, thanks for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
On my left is a repeat visitor, Bob Ravitz, the Oklahoma County Public Defender for the last 14 years, the Chief Public Defender. Bob is Vice Chairman of the Oklahoma Board of Juvenile Affairs, is a trial lawyer, is a lecturer, and has actually argued cases before the United States Supreme Court, which is a rarity among lawyers. And Bob understands much about the confidentiality of records and the openness or lack thereof. Bob, thanks for coming.
Thank you, Kent.
I want to start off, Ben, by talking about Oklahoma's openness of both records and meetings. I know you were intimately involved in the passage of the Oklahoma Open Records Act and the Open Meetings Act. Tell our viewers just very briefly what those two acts do.
Well, the two of them, the Open Meetings Act, have to do with all boards, bodies, commissions that use public facilities or expend in any part of public funds. And if they do those things, like, for example, maybe a fair board, that's a public grounds, then they're subject. So all of these, and it spells out, and it became necessary, Kent, because there was a lot of confusion. And some boards were saying, no, that we're not subject to that, and others. And the biggest offender seemed to be the school boards, where the most confusion seemed to be. So it says that they must have an agenda before the meeting. They must have, for their regular meetings, they must post those with the county clerk if they're a county body, or the Office of the Secretary of State if they're a state body, so that people can go someplace, or those two places, and find out when the board meets.
Who enforces this?
Actually, it's supposed to be the district attorneys are supposed to enforce it. I've never seen the district attorneys step in and do anything unless they were prodded to do it. Mm-hmm. I'm really critical of them because of that. So until someone has a complaint and can convince the district attorney to do something about that particular errant body, but let me go on and say that there's more. You got to post the agenda. There's provisions for regular meetings, special meetings, emergency meetings, so that you can deal with those things, storms and so forth. But then it says in the open meetings law, it states those things that are particularly open, and so it really became necessary, and it's been amended down through the years. I think it is an excellent act. I would rank it on a range of 1 to 10 as a 9. There may be some states, like Tennessee, perhaps, but it doesn't cover the legislature. It does not cover the judicial. Why? Because the Constitution says they shall make their own rules.
What about the open records? What are we trying to get? Prior to the passage of the Open Records Act, did we have a bunch of closed records?
Well, let me say, too, in both of these, in the adoption of the Open Meetings Law Act, and then later in the Open Records Act, we had intense discussion. There were some people in the media who felt it wasn't necessary, but they were a minority, and the majority voted to try to achieve these specific pieces of legislation. When it came to the Records Act, it was an old thing that was on the books and vague, and is referred to, at least by myself, as when George Nye had the fancy doghouse in his backyard as governor. Some of the press or the media went over to find out who paid for it, how much, and so forth like that. The Supreme Court threw it out, and so consequently we started all over. And we actually looked at all of the other states and came up with the present, and it has been amended since then, the present Open Records Act.
Well, let me ask Bob something. Bob, you're deeply involved in juvenile matters. Your office represents juvenile defenders, juvenile offenders, alleged offenders, through your public defender's office. Many of the juvenile records are closed. Why is that? Why is it necessary to close criminal records of juvenile offenders?
Well, the whole purpose behind the juvenile code was to hopefully rehabilitate the offender. And the best way to rehabilitate an offender
is in secret?
Well, no, it's not in secret. Everybody knows about it. It's just that if you tell the school that Johnny is being worked with to try to cure his substance abuse problem, Johnny's going to be ostracized at school. If Johnny is a sex offender who should be kept in the juvenile courts, he's going to be ostracized by his neighbors. And the whole purpose is to make this person a productive member of society. That was the purpose behind juvenile codes. If the person is going to be considered an adult, then I agree juvenile records should become open, but only if that person is going to be considered an adult.
Well, let's talk about the sex offender, the juvenile sex offender that isn't going to be treated as an adult. Don't the neighbors have a protective right to know about that?
Well, it depends on what we're trying to do with the child. In my opinion, if what we're trying to do is help the child, the answer is no. Because as a practical matter, sexual offenders are going to be placed in institutions, at least initially. If we believe in rehabilitation, then we've got to work with that kid within the system and not publicize his or her name to society.
Well, when can we publish juvenile records or alleged crimes of juveniles?
Well, Oklahoma has recently changed their statute, and basically any juvenile who would have been who commits a crime that would have been a felony if he was an adult, that name is available to the public now.
Ben, what do you think about that? Should that be open? Should juvenile records be open across the board?
When they're filed on as an adult.
Only?
When they're filed on as an adult, you know, and we have two things. One is whether they're charged with the police.
Right.
And I back up to the point to where the district attorney is actually filed on them.
Okay.
And I disagree with a recent 8-to-1 opinion of the Oklahoma Supreme Court that said, well, the media can get that information, but you're entitled to have it because they've been filed on an adult matter for, say, rape or murder, but you're going to have to go to court and get an order. And I object strenuously to that. I don't think that should be necessary at all.
Ben, I got to jump in.
Go
Get us to a break. We'll be right back. We're discussing the First Amendment. Specifically, how is it working in Oklahoma? You're watching The Verdict.
Yeah, campfire's a lot of fun. You get to make some friends. You get to do some cool stuff. Campfire's for boys too, not just girls. But hey, campfire's definitely for kids. So call the campfire office nearest you to join in on the fun. 'Cause let's face it, you're not getting any younger.
St. Gregory's University has been changing the lives of people like me for 125 years. Affordable, private Catholic education, balanced with dedication to community and service, makes St. Gregory special. We're extremely proud of our students' outstanding academic achievements and our nationally ranked athletic teams. It's when you help a student build a future of balance, integrity, and service that you change a life forever. St. Gregory's, a community for life.
Yesterday was plain awful. You can say that again.
On Broadway is Oklahoma's premier youth musical theater company.
Bringing our daughter here was one of the smartest things we've ever done.
I've learned a lot. I've gained a lot of confidence. They helped me develop talents I never knew I had.
And it's fun.
On Broadway, Oklahoma's premier youth musical theater company. Now enrolling in Edmond. Call 330-CAST. That's 330-2278.
Every day, in state governments throughout the country, crucial decisions are being made that affect the lives of children and their families. But as this process takes place, children are often left voiceless. when these children raise their hands to be heard. Is anyone listening? There are people listening. They are child advocates. Join us and raise your hand for kids.
Back on The Verdict, we're discussing the First Amendment with a specific emphasis on Oklahoma-related issues. But, Kent, there's also a big question about privacy and who should have a private life.
Well, there's a real tension between, on the one hand, freedom of information, freedom of the press, and on the other hand, a right to privacy. If you're a member of the press, what can you learn about me? What can you do with me? Don't I have a right to privacy? Don't I have a right to be left alone? I want to read a quote. The press is overstepping in every direction the obvious bounds of propriety and of decorum. Sounds like something we might hear today. That quote came from Louis Brandeis in 1890. I suspect the press has been criticized for overstepping bounds of decorum and propriety for as long as there has been press.
No question.
But how do you balance? How do you balance the right to privacy on the one hand and freedom of the press on the other? Bob, what do you think?
Well, I think one's privacy is the most important right of a citizen. And I think the press has to do things that are newsworthy. But unfortunately, the press has acted irresponsibly, whether it's the George Bush's daughters who are arrested for having a drink when they're 19.
So
and they're
that's going too far?
They're blasted. Well, to report it, no. To blast it over to the news media over and over and over again, yes, that's gone too far.
Autopsy photos.
Autopsy photos have no business being admitted. They're just there to prejudice society. What good does it? It's not good for the victim's family. It's not good for any defendant who is charged with a crime. It'll prevent the defendant possibly from getting a fair trial. And what good does it do for the community to publish these things except to invade somebody's privacy?
Crime scene photos. I've seen Nicole Brown Simpson's crime scene photos. Do I have a right to see that?
And they're horrible. I mean,
yeah, they are.
They're horrible. And if Nicole Brown Simpson's family doesn't want those photos shown, why should we show them to them? Why should we show somebody's butchered by somebody? What good does it do?
But why should we not? I mean,
because people have a right to privacy. They have a right to live their own lives.
Well, you would then, on balance, let the right to privacy overcome freedom of the press.
Yes.
Ben, what do you think?
No kidding, huh? Well, first of all, I'd like to stick in a definition of news. News, one way, and there are several definitions of news, is people in conflict with society. Then we have a regular private individual. You know, Bob may be a semi-private individual. After all, he's a public official. And then we have those who are holding themselves out for public acceptance, like Simpson, you know, entertainers, and sports figures, and so forth like that.
Now, President Bush is a public figure, no doubt about it. And what about his daughters, who just happen to be his kin?
They come under that same cloak to a great extent, and that's just one of the fortunate or unfortunate. I'm sure they like the fortunate part of it. But when they went into this restaurant and ordered some alcoholic beverages, whether beer or something else, you know, and gave a fake ID card, well, it became more of a public interest.
Well, what about if they're dating a guy? Is that public interest? Don't they have a right to date the boy they want without the boy's picture being put on the front page of the local Dallas paper or on the front page?
They're not a private individual anymore. They're really not.
I mean, they didn't choose this public life.
Well,
their
father did, and that's one of the handicaps that the family has to go through.
But who you're dating, how is that newsworthy, Ben? I mean, seriously, it's a practical matter. Who the president's daughter is dating is absolutely not newsworthy.
Okay.
Unless you define news as being anything that'll improve your ratings. If you define it that way, then maybe it is newsworthy. But otherwise, it's not.
I want to back up just a little bit more besides that definition and say that we now have around us the most highly competitive news media situation that we've ever had in our history. There's at least probably 100 television channels, cable channels, newspapers, dailies and weeklies and magazines. And so all of these, look at the supermarket tabloids, for example, for excesses, and some of them try to do their dead level damnness, you know, to get attention.
Or to get a profit.
Well, hopefully they make a profit, you know. I mean, that's their intent. If they don't, the government's going to have to subsidize them, right?
Well, let me change the subject just a little bit. The private lives, the private lives of public figures in the past and as it is today. The private life of President Eisenhower was pretty much kept private.
Different era.
The private life of John Kennedy was kept private while he was alive. Information came out thereafter. Private lives of Bill Clinton, Gary Hart, John Tower, not handled that way at all by the media.
Well, and sports figures too, Kent. I mean,
Sure.
sports figures were put up on a pedestal. The media won't let us have heroes anymore.
Well, that was back when we were paying sports figures, say $15,000 or $25,000 a year too. Now
I don't think that
Well, I
matters.
mean, they're far more important. They're making bigger money.
I think it's
they're
the
bigger
media.
Celebrities.
I don't think the sports figures change. I think the media changed.
But that's exactly
the
the
more
point. There's
media, the
celebrities.
media more competitive. You mean?
Yes.
Yes. Well,
of course.
More vigorous.
Well, they have to be vigorous to survive in the hunt.
At what price? At what price to society?
When it finally gets to stinking so bad that people will turn them off or criticize them or get after their sponsors, will they do the same thing to the newspapers or the magazines or the supermarket tabloids? They said, I'm not going to pick up that filth. I'm not going to buy into that. Well, then, they do all kinds of polling. They're going to begin to back up and use a little more discretion, it seemed to me.
Well, one last subject real quickly. Gary Condit, the congressman, two of the networks
He's out
splashed
of the news
it.
now. We don't have to listen to him anymore.
I know it, but you do me. Two of the networks picked up that story, ran with it, and CBS did not. Dan Rather did not for a long time, and then finally decided to. The media still retains some discretion on what they will run and what they won't run.
Whatever happened to Chandra Levy? I don't know. I'm sort of wondered myself
Well,
now. She brought it up.
I mean, but you know how long it was on? On every TV station, hours and hours and hours on all the talk shows. And you know the tragedy about that? At the same time that people were being butchered in Afghanistan, where women were being beaten, nobody knew about that. That wasn't on television. That was news. Gary Condit was maybe news for 5 minutes, but we kept it going. We kept it going forever and ever and ever. That's all we heard about on all the channels that do news 24 hours a day.
Including Oklahoma.
Absolutely.
Well, they're lazy. They just didn't go out to get the other stuff.
No.
That was the thing that they thought that purely appealed to the public, and they worked it over and over, did it, and things. They thought maybe we all have Alzheimer's or something that we can.
Well, they were just waiting for the next big story to take its place.
Well, there are such things in the news business of a no-news day.
Well, tell Geraldo.
Yeah, huh?
Tell Geraldo that.
Oh, wait, I mean, so consequently, they reach down in the file and say, oh, well, let's do Condit again.
Yeah. Well, if it got a good rating last night, maybe it'll get a good rating tonight. We've got to wrap this show up at this point. I can tell we're going to have another show on First Amendment. Mr. Blackstock, Mr. Ravitz, thank you for coming by. Kent and I'll be back with a few final thoughts when we return. You're watching The Verdict with Mick Cornett and Kent Myers.
Hello, my name is Ted Smith. I'm president of the board of directors of the Oklahoma Disability Law Center. ODLC provides free legal services in civil matters to people with physical and mental disabilities.
I'm Mike Sykes, vice president of ODLC. For more information, call 1-800-880-7755.
The Oklahoma Disability Law Center provides high-quality legal services to people with physical and mental disabilities.
You see
Boy Scouts of America, where above all else, character counts.
Bringing out the best in each student. That is the simple goal and tradition of Heritage Hall. The focus on the individual shapes the educational experience at Heritage Hall. Each student benefits from small classes, able, dedicated teachers, a solid academic curriculum, and exceptional co-curricular programs of athletics, arts, community service, and other activities, parental involvement, personalized counseling, and the development of responsibility, integrity, and love of learning. If you want education taught with pride, then you want Heritage Hall.
And welcome back. We're wrapping up another edition of The Verdict. Today we discussed the First Amendment and how it applies to some issues taking place in Oklahoma and around the world.
Yeah, we're trying to balance things, and that's always difficult. Balance free press versus right to privacy. Very, very difficult things to discuss. Mr. Blackstock brought up some really good issues about the definition of news. Is it simply morbid curiosity that we're entitled to publish freely? Is it news that sells papers and gets ratings on television? Or is it something that really is newsworthy? And who's to judge that? I don't think the Constitution gives most people the right to make that independent decision. What it really boils down to is whose ox is being gored. If it's something about me, I may think it's very private. If it's something about you, I might be glad that I'm able to see it.
And I'm not suggesting we head in this direction, but a media that didn't have to turn a profit for however it could be set up would be a totally different media.
Totally different. And during the early years of or the middle years of this century, that was more close to true than not.
It is. Well, thanks again to our guests, Ben Blackstock and Bob Ravitz. And don't forget to check out our website, theverdict.tv. Tell us what you think. For Kent Myers, I'm Mick Cornett. We'll see you next time on The Verdict. This program was brought to you by Crow and Dunlevy, a professional corporation. And also brought to you by a friend of Oklahoma Lawyers for Children and Delta Dental Plan of Oklahoma.